driving and one who's not driving. You're both going to go through exactly the same scenery. You'll go through exactly the same situation. You're moving at the same speed. One of you will notice a lot more than the other. And that's because one of you has more simplicity. The person driving cannot afford simplicity. The person driving has to know the speed, and depending on how good you are in the speed, has to watch for police behind you. I mean, just the whole thing. Okay. I'd also need to point out, for those of you who have families, this model falls apart if you have children in the car. Okay? If you have children in the car, everyone's under stress. That's a given. Okay? But presuming, it's a husband and wife going on a trip, the person who's driving has much less simplicity just by the nature of the thing, and does not experience the trip in the same way or to its fullness. Well, Francis noticed this. Francis was a very, very wealthy young man. And he noticed that, like, for instance, if his family wanted to go on trips, they had lots of money. If they wanted to go on trips, first of all, they needed to make sure someone was there to guard their possessions. And while they were on their trips, their father was always concerned, are they guarding my possessions? And his whole, the simplicity of his life was totally lost. So Francis really kind of wanted this simplicity, and he kept looking for ways to get to simplicity. And one of the strange things is, most people believe the way to simplicity is money. So that the more money you have, you can hire people to guard your stuff, you can live in a gated community, that money seems to be the key to arriving at simplicity, where you'll have no more worries. If you ever listen to things on TV where they talk about retirement, they're all aiming at the fact that money will give you simplicity. You have so much money, you don't need to worry about medical problems. You have so much money, and the key to all this for them is money. And so Francis was kind of wrestling with this to try and figure out how this would go on. He had two pivotal experiences in his life. One is that we are all familiar with. In the world in which Francis lived, if you were very, very wealthy, the way you showed it was you went to daily Mass. And there are lots of people who would go to daily Mass every day, whose religious commitment you could really question. But they were actually advertising the fact that they didn't have to work. And so people would go to this. And I probably, if you remember the article that we did about the second window back there, which is Isidore and Maria. Isidore used to go to daily Mass, and he was a day laborer. And so the guy who owned the ranch where Isidore worked used to keep assigning him more work, because if he was at church, obviously he didn't have enough to do. So he just, kept assigning him more and more work, and he always got it done. So one day on his way home from work, he asked Isidore just to get on the back of his horse, and he took Isidore home. And when Isidore was getting off where Isidore was supposed to be working, there was someone plowing the field. And the man asked Isidore, "Who's that?" Isidore says, "Whenever I want to go to church, my guardian angel plows the field while I'm gone." And that's why if you look at the window, if you look right off the shoulder of Isidore, you'll see a small drawing of an angel plowing a field. And that was the whole thing. That was a sign of wealth if you could actually go to daily Mass. And so Francis was going to daily Mass, and he was mulling over this, and he was listening to the readings. I should mention that, allowing his age and his frequency of attending Mass, he had heard that reading over 300 times. It comes up several times a year. So Francis is sitting there, and Jesus encounters a rich young man, and suddenly grabs Francis, because he is in fact a rich young man. And Jesus says to the rich young man, "You want to be perfect? Sell what you have, give to the poor, come follow me." And that entered Francis like lightning. And Francis stood up, took off all his clothes, and walked out of the church, never turned back. And for the rest of his life, he stayed away from everything. Everything. He wouldn't own anything. He stayed completely away from everything. Now, you and I know Francis as being this wonderful person of nature, but it's simplicity that allowed him to experience nature. And the reason why we know him as such a person of nature is because he happened to live in a world where there was more nature than civilization. If he lived in a world where there was more civilization, you and I would know Francis differently. But Francis simply went around the world in which he lived, and he went around it in great simplicity so that he could experience God in all kinds of things. Okay? I thought one of the interesting things one time in San Luis Obispo, I went over to the local Baptist church for one thing or another, and when I got over there, I noticed in their garden there was a statue of St. Francis of Assisi. I was thinking to myself, a statue at a Baptist church? What's going on? You know? And the fact of the matter is, no one considers Francis Catholic, and no one considers Francis a saint. Everyone considers Francis a hippie. And so we always think of him as in the garden. If you have a garden, Francis belongs there. It's like a gnome. Okay, you put Francis there. But this whole idea of Francis's great experience, he had an amazing ability to find great experience in the world around him. I should also mention we have no writings from Francis. Maybe a few little things, but you know, like that, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. That comes out of the Franciscan community, but it's not really possible to say that Francis wrote it. He may have, you know, but not really. Writings were not his main thing. The second major event in his life was contact with a leper. He was one time working and saw a man beside the road who really needed help, a leper. And so Francis, you know, being a good and a kind man, and this was after he had taken his step towards simplicity and began living his life. So he began to take care of the man, and one of the things he noticed in himself was that he was very careful about touching the man's sores and stuff like this, as I think all of us would be. And Francis realized that also was a lack of simplicity. He says, I'm too concerned about what I'm doing. So what he did was take his hands and rub them through all the man's wounds. And then went on with the thing. But it let him know simplicity, oftentimes violation of simplicity is the rules I impose on myself or the fears. And I think all of us know, we all have phobias. And those phobias close little areas of our lives. Well, that was what Francis was about. Francis was about nothing should be closed. You might accidentally close the door through which God is trying to reach you. So you close no doors. Simplicity is you keep them all open, and wherever God shows up, you can get him in. Okay? And so this was really key. He wanted to understand what it was to be united with poor people, what it was to be united with sick people, what it was to live in unity, particularly with people's needs. Because he says their needs oftentimes are where their simplicity is. Not what they have, but what they're missing. Okay? And I think all of us at one time or another have had different you know, experiences that, let's say you're in a hospital and really in a very bad shape. And for one reason or another, they bring you, let's say, chicken soup or something, and you suddenly realize you enjoy it like you've never enjoyed chicken soup in your life. You have chicken soup sitting on your shelf at home, you never open it. But at that moment, and he says that oftentimes the weaknesses of people open them to a fuller experience of what's going on around them. That became very much a part of Francis's life. So he began to focus on the Word of God as being transforming. And he understood that this Word of God, the scriptural Word of God, was to transform and build him. But if I were to take the model, when Francis talks about the Word of God transforming, the model he's looking at is the day he heard the verse that changed him. The model he's not looking at is the model of a student. St. Francis was really against education. And it was actually a generation after Francis before any Franciscan got any kind of an education. And the reason why Francis was against education was education in his world made you rich. And so he avoided it. And he also considered it as one of the things that brought complications into a life.